The teapot cracked against the wall before Eleanor Hart even understood why she had thrown it. She stood frozen in the narrow servants' corridor, her hands still trembling from the motion, the shattered porcelain scattered across the stone floor like broken teeth. Behind her, footsteps approached fast, heavy, urgent. She turned to find the Duke himself standing in the doorway of the breakfast room, his face pale with something that looked less like anger and more like fear. That was not how her first morning at Ashcombe Hall was supposed to begin. 3 hours earlier, Eleanor had arrived at the towering stone estate with a single trunk and a letter of introduction clutched in her gloved hand. The carriage driver had refused to meet her eyes when she asked about her new employer, muttering only that the Duke of Ashcombe was a private man who did not like questions. She had thought little of it at the time. After her father's debts had swallowed everything her family owned, she had learned to stop expecting comfort from strangers. A position as housekeeper, even in a house with a strange reputation, was better than the alternative. The housekeeper who trained her, a stern woman named Margaret Fenwick, walked her through the halls with brisk efficiency, listing duties in a flat, practiced voice. Linens on Tuesdays, silver polished every third day. The library was never to be disturbed before noon. And the breakfast room, Margaret said, pausing for the first time, was to be set exactly the same way every single morning, without exception. Eleanor had nodded, expecting nothing unusual. Then she saw the table. 2 cups sat at opposite ends, each filled with tea that had gone cold, each untouched. 2 plates, 2 folded napkins, as if 2 people were expected, though Margaret had told her plainly that the Duke ate alone, every day, in silence. Eleanor stared at the second setting for a long moment. Is someone joining him? No, Margaret said, and something in her voice closed like a door. Clear it after breakfast, set it again tomorrow. Do not ask him about it. Do not ask anyone about it. That is the only rule in this house that matters. Eleanor had worked in enough houses to know when a warning was serious. She said nothing more. But she could not stop looking at that second cup as she moved through her morning tasks, could not stop wondering who it was meant for, and why an entire household had apparently agreed, without discussion, never to speak of it. She got her answer to the wondering, if not the reason, less than an hour later. The Duke entered the breakfast room precisely at 8, as Margaret had said he would. He was younger than Eleanor expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair beginning to show the first threads of gray at the temples and eyes that seemed permanently fixed on something far beyond the walls of the room. He did not greet her. He barely seemed to register that she existed, though she stood near the sideboard with a fresh pot of tea in her hands, waiting to be needed. He sat. He looked at the second cup, the one across from his own place, for a long moment. Then he reached out and adjusted it slightly, turning the handle a fraction of an inch, as though correcting something only he could see was wrong. Eleanor should have said nothing. Every instinct trained into her by years of service told her to remain silent, to fade into the wallpaper the way good staff were meant to. But the question had been building in her chest since Margaret's warning, and something about the careful, aching way he touched that cup broke through her restraint before she could stop it. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, "but who is the second cup for?" The room went utterly still. The Duke's hand froze on the porcelain. Slowly he lifted his eyes to hers, and what she saw there was not the annoyance she expected, but something closer to shock, as if she had struck him. For a moment he said nothing at all. Then his voice came out low and hard. "That is not your concern. I only wondered. You were told the rules of this house." His voice rose, sharp enough to make her flinch. "Did no one explain them to you clearly enough?" "I was told not to ask," Eleanor said, and even as fear coiled in her stomach, some stubborn part of her refused to back down entirely. "I was not told why." He stood so quickly his chair scraped hard against the floor. For a moment she thought he might shout, might dismiss her on the spot, might do any number of things men of his rank did when a servant forgot her place. Instead, he simply stared at her, his jaw tight, his hands curled at his sides, and said nothing at all. Then he turned and walked out of the room without touching his breakfast, leaving both cups exactly as they were. Eleanor stood alone in the sudden silence, her heart hammering, already certain she had ruined everything within her first hour of employment. It was Margaret who found her minutes later, cleaning up the tea things with shaking hands. The older woman took one look at her face and sighed, long and tired, the sigh of someone who had seen this exact expression before. "You asked him," Margaret said. "It was not a question. I did not mean to overstep. I told you not to." But there was no real anger in Margaret's voice, only weariness. She began helping Eleanor gather the dishes, her movements automatic from long habit. "You will learn, if you stay, that some questions in this house are not really questions at all. They are wounds, and His grace does not appreciate having them touched, no matter how gently. Then why does no one simply tell him to stop this ritual? 2 cups, every morning, for years, from what I understand. Surely someone has asked him to stop. Margaret's hands paused over the broken pieces of porcelain that Eleanor had, in her fright, accidentally sent crashing to the floor. Her expression flickered with something like sorrow. Some habits are not something a person can simply stop, Miss Hart. Some habits are the only thing holding a person together. Eleanor wanted to press further, but the older woman's face had closed again, the same careful blankness that seemed to fall over every member of the household whenever the subject arose. And she swept up the broken teapot instead, working in silence, and let the matter rest, at least for the moment. But rest did not come easily to her mind that night. She lay awake in her small room beneath the eaves, and staring at the ceiling, turning the morning over and over. The Duke's face when she had asked the question. Not anger, not truly. Grief, raw and unguarded, before he had managed to bury it again beneath cold formality. Whatever the second cup meant, it clearly meant everything to him, and the entire staff had learned, likely through hard experience, that the safest kindness they could offer him was silence. Eleanor was not naturally a curious person by nature. She had spent the last 2 years of her life learning to keep her head down, to ask for nothing, to want nothing beyond a roof and a wage. But there was something about the careful, deliberate way Alexander Whitmore had turned that cup, adjusting it as though it belonged to someone who might still walk through the door at any moment, that would not leave her alone. The next morning, she set the table exactly as instructed. 2 cups, 2 plates, 2 napkins, folded with care. She told herself she would say nothing more, would learn her place properly this time, would simply be the quiet, competent housekeeper the position required. When the Duke entered and saw the table set correctly, something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, and he gave her the smallest nod of acknowledgement before taking his seat. It was not gratitude, not quite, but it was not the fury of the day before either. Eleanor busied herself with the sideboard, keeping her eyes down, her questions locked firmly behind her teeth, and yet, as she watched him from the corner of her vision, watched him glance at that second cup with an expression of quiet, private sorrow that he clearly believed no one could see, she understood one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to be able to leave this alone. Whatever secret lived inside that second cup, whatever loss had carved itself so deeply into this man, that an entire household had organized itself around protecting his silence. Eleanor Hart was going to find out what it was. She simply did not yet know how much that answer would cost her, or how deeply it would change the course of her own life once she finally learned the truth. Later that afternoon, while airing the linens in the East Wing, Eleanor crossed paths with Henry, the elderly butler who had served the Whitmore family for nearly 30 years. He was a quiet man, slow of step but sharp of eye, and he watched her with a look that suggested he already knew exactly what had happened at breakfast. "You are the one who asked him about the cup," Henry said, not unkindly, as he set down a stack of folded towels. "News travels quickly in this house. News of that particular subject travels faster than anything else." He studied her for a moment, as though weighing how much to say. "You should know, Miss Hart, that His Grace was not always like this. There was a time when this house was full of noise, laughter in the corridors, music from the drawing room most evenings. He was not always a man who took his meals in silence." What changed him? Henry's expression grew careful. The same guarded stillness she had seen in Margaret. "That is not mine to tell. But I will say this much, because I think it may help you keep your position rather than lose it. His Grace is not cruel. He is not the kind of master who punishes curiosity for its own sake. What you saw this morning was not anger at you. It was anger at himself for being caught unguarded by a question he has spent years avoiding." Eleanor considered this carefully. Then perhaps if someone simply spoke to him gently about it, rather than avoiding the subject entirely, he might find some relief in finally saying it aloud. "Perhaps," Henry said, though his tone made clear he doubted it would be so simple. "But grief does not always want to be spoken. Sometimes it only wants to be left in peace. You would do well to remember that, if you intend to remain here." She thanked him for the warning, though she suspected, even as the words left her mouth, that she had no real intention of heeding it. There was something in her that had always resisted silence when silence concealed suffering. Some old stubborn instinct inherited from a mother who believed that wounds left untended only grew worse with time. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever loss had driven a duke to set 2 cups on his table every morning for years on end, Eleanor did not believe that pretending it did not exist was truly kindness. She believed it was only a slower, quieter kind of hurting. That evening, as she passed the breakfast room on her way to bed, she paused in the doorway. The table had long since been cleared, The 2 cups washed and put away until morning, yet she found herself picturing them still sitting there in the dark, waiting patiently for a guest who never came. Somewhere beyond that empty table lived a story, and Eleanor Hart, whatever the cost might prove to be, had already decided she would not rest until she understood it. She closed the door softly and climbed the stairs to her small room, carrying the weight of that decision with her into an uneasy sleep. The letter arrived without warning, slipped beneath the kitchen door sometime in the night, and by the time Eleanor found it, the entire household was already in an uproar. Margaret held the envelope at arm's length as though it might bite her. It bears no seal, no name, only His Grace's title, written in a hand I do not recognize. She glanced toward the staircase, her face pale. Someone will need to bring it to him. No one volunteered. The younger maids busied themselves suddenly with tasks that did not require them to go near the study, and even Henry found urgent reason to be elsewhere. Eleanor, still new enough not to fully understand the fear that gripped the room, took the letter from Margaret's hand. I will bring it. Miss Hart. It is only a letter, Margaret. She was already moving toward the stairs before the older woman could argue further. She found the Duke in his study, bent over a ledger of estate accounts, his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his dark hair falling loose across his forehead in a way that made him look, for just a moment, less like a duke and more like an exhausted man doing his best to hold something together. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression tightened when he saw what she carried. Where did this come from? It was left at the kitchen door sometime in the night, Your Grace. No one saw who delivered it. He took it from her carefully, almost reluctantly, and turned it over in his hands without opening it. For a long moment he simply stared at the blank exterior, his jaw working, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from the way his composure seemed to fracture, just slightly, at the mere sight of unfamiliar handwriting. You may go, he said finally. She should have gone. Every rule of her position told her to leave immediately, to give him privacy for whatever this letter meant to him. But she lingered near the door, watching as he finally broke the seal and unfolded the single page inside. She watched the color drain from his face as he read, watched his hand tighten around the paper until his knuckles went white. Your Grace? He did not answer. He simply stood, crossed to the fireplace, and fed the letter to the flames without a word of explanation, watching until every trace of it had curled to ash. Only then did he turn back to her, his expression once again carefully composed, though his eyes still carried the shadow of whatever he had just read. That will be all, Miss Hart. She left the study with more questions than she had entered with, and no closer to any answers. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself paying closer attention to the rhythms of the household, cataloging small details the way she once cataloged her father's debts, searching for patterns that might explain what she had witnessed. She noticed that the Duke rarely left the estate grounds, and when he did, he traveled only to the small village church on the edge of the property, always alone, always in the early hours before the rest of the household woke. She noticed that an entire wing of the house, the east wing beyond the library, remained permanently locked, its windows shuttered even during the brightest hours of the day. She noticed that whenever anyone mentioned the name Charlotte, even in passing, a peculiar silence fell over whoever was speaking, as though the word itself carried some kind of danger. It was from one of the younger maids, a shy girl named Clara who had not yet fully learned the art of guarded silence, that Eleanor finally heard the name spoken aloud with any detail. She was to be his wife, Clara whispered one evening as they folded linens together in the laundry room, glancing repeatedly toward the door as though afraid of being overheard. Charlotte Ainsworth, the loveliest woman I ever saw, and kind, too. Not the sort of kindness great ladies only pretend at. She used to bring us all sweets from the village on Sundays. What happened to her? Clara's face grew troubled. No one truly knows, or if they know, they do not say. She simply stopped coming to the house one autumn, and within a season, His Grace had become an entirely different man. Quieter, colder, he stopped attending village gatherings, stopped receiving visitors, started this strange business with the second cup, though I could not tell you exactly why, or what it is meant to mean. You don't believe it is simply grief? That she died, perhaps? If she died, there was no funeral I ever heard of, no grave in the family plot bearing her name. And grief, however deep, does not usually come with such secrecy attached to it. There is something more to the story than sorrow alone, Miss Hart. I am certain of it, though I could not say what. Eleanor turned this information over carefully in the days that followed, fitting it alongside everything else she had observed. A woman who had vanished without explanation. A letter that had shaken the Duke badly enough to burn it immediately upon reading. A locked wing of the house that no one was permitted to enter. And through all of it, that second cup, set faithfully every single morning. as though its owner might still, after all this time, walk through the door and claim it. She might have continued gathering these fragments in silence indefinitely, had an encounter one evening not changed the careful distance between herself and the Duke entirely. She had been sent to retrieve a book from the library at his request, something to occupy him during a sleepless night, and she found him there already, seated near the cold fireplace with a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring into the empty grate as though it might offer answers the rest of the world refused to give him. "Your Grace, I did not mean to intrude." "Stay," he said, surprising her, for a moment at least. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether this was truly an invitation or simply the exhaustion of a man too tired to enforce his usual boundaries. But something in his voice, some rare note of vulnerability, drew her further into the room despite every instinct urging caution. "You wonder about the letter," he said, without looking at her. "I saw it in your face when you left my study. You are not skilled at hiding your thoughts, Miss Hart, whatever else you may be skilled at. I did not mean to pry, and yet you have not stopped thinking about it since." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "I have watched you these past days, watching me. You believe I have not noticed, but I notice everything in this house. It is, perhaps, the only thing left to occupy my mind." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, caught between embarrassment and something else she was not yet ready to name. "Forgive me. It was not my intention to make you uncomfortable." "You did not make me uncomfortable." He finally looked at her, and the raw honesty in his expression startled her into stillness. "You made me remember what it feels like to be looked at as a man, rather than as a title, or a tragedy, or a cautionary tale whispered about in the village. It has been a long time since anyone has done that." The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have been. Eleanor did not know how to answer him, did not know what response could possibly match the weight of what he had just admitted, so she said nothing at all, and simply held his gaze until he looked away first, retreating once again behind the careful composure he wore like armor. "You should go to bed, Miss Hart," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will come early, as it always does." She left the library that night with her heart beating strangely in her chest, uncertain whether the ache she carried with her up the stairs was concern for a grieving stranger, or something far more dangerous beginning to take root in its place. 2 days later, a visitor arrived at Ashcombe Hall who disturbed the household's careful peace far more than any anonymous letter ever could. Lord Edmund Whitmore, the Duke's younger cousin and, by the law of inheritance, next in line should Alexander die without an heir, arrived unannounced in a carriage far too grand for a simple family visit. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window as he stepped down, straightening his coat with the practiced elegance of a man who enjoyed being looked at, and felt an immediate, instinctive unease she could not fully explain. "He comes twice a year, without fail," Margaret muttered, watching alongside her. "Always with the same purpose, though he dresses it up in different words each time." "What purpose is that?" "To remind his Grace that the family line grows thinner, with every year he refuses to remarry. Lord Edmund stands to inherit everything, the title, the land, this very house, should Alexander continue on his current path without producing an heir of his own. I do not think Lord Edmund minds the waiting nearly as much as he pretends to." Eleanor found herself assigned to serve refreshments in the drawing room that afternoon, a task that placed her uncomfortably close to a conversation she suspected she was not meant to fully understand. Lord Edmund lounged in his chair with easy confidence, while Alexander sat rigid and formal across from him, every line of his posture suggesting a man enduring rather than enjoying his guest's company. "You cannot mourn a ghost forever, Alexander," Edmund said, swirling the wine in his glass. "It has been 3 years. The family grows restless. Surely even you must see how this looks to outsiders. This strange devotion to a woman who is not even here to appreciate it. My private grief is not a matter for family discussion. Everything about this house is a matter for family discussion when the future of the title hangs upon it." Edmund's eyes flicked briefly toward Eleanor as she poured his tea, and something calculating passed across his expression before he returned his attention to his cousin. "The Marquis of Halsworth has a daughter of marriageable age, a sensible match, advantageous to both families. I only ask that you consider it, rather than dismissing the notion outright, as you have every previous suggestion. I will consider nothing until I am ready." "And when precisely will that be? When the estate has fallen so far into disrepair that there is nothing left worth inheriting? When the whispers in the village have grown so loud that even the staff no longer bother lowering their voices?" Edmund's gaze flicked toward Eleanor again, deliberate this time, and she felt her stomach tighten under the weight of his scrutiny. "Speaking of staff, I understand you have hired someone new. A rather forward young woman, from what I hear. Eleanor's work here is not your concern." Everything in this house is my concern, cousin, whether either of us wishes it to be so. Edmund's smile did not reach his eyes. I only offer a word of caution. It would be a terrible shame if idle gossip about a housekeeper's forwardness were to reach the wrong ears in the village, particularly given how quickly rumors seem to spread in these parts already. The threat, thinly veiled as it was, hung in the air long after Edmund had finished speaking. Eleanor kept her eyes carefully lowered, her hands steady on the teapot despite the sudden pounding of her heart, and did not allow herself to react in any way that might give him further satisfaction. Alexander's response, when it came, surprised her. "You will not speak of Miss Hart again in this house," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority Eleanor had not yet heard from him. "Not in that tone, and not with that implication. Is that understood?" Edmund raised his hands in mock surrender, though the calculating look never fully left his eyes. "Of course, cousin. I meant no offense, merely an observation." The visit ended shortly after, with promises of correspondence that Eleanor suspected neither man intended to honor sincerely. Once Edmund's carriage had disappeared down the long drive, Alexander remained standing at the window for a long while, his shoulders tight with a tension that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of protecting something he was not yet ready to name. Eleanor found him there still when she came to clear the tea things, and though neither of them spoke of what had passed between them, something had shifted in the space that separated them. Some invisible boundary quietly redrawn without either party fully acknowledging it aloud. That night, lying awake in her small room, Eleanor turned Lord Edmund's words over in her mind, searching for the shape of the threat hidden beneath his polished manners. He had spoken of gossip reaching the wrong ears, of rumors spreading through the village, and though he had framed it as concern for propriety, she recognized something colder underneath it. The careful positioning of a man who wanted the title for himself, and saw her, however small her role, as an unwelcome complication to remove. She thought, too, of the way Alexander had defended her. Sharp and immediate, without pause for consideration of how it might look. It was not the reaction of a man who saw her merely as staff. She did not know what to make of that realization, only that it frightened her nearly as much as it warmed something long dormant in her chest, and she fell asleep still turning the two feelings over against each other, unable to settle on which one she trusted more. The scream tore through the east wing before Eleanor had even decided to go there. She had told herself, walking the darkened corridor with a single candle in hand, that she was simply lost, that she had taken a wrong turn on her way back from the linen closet. It was not entirely a lie, but some part of her had known exactly where her feet were carrying her, toward the locked door at the far end of the hall that no member of the staff was permitted to approach, and when the scream came from behind it, sharp and raw and unmistakably human, every rational excuse she had built for herself collapsed at once. She dropped the candle and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering, fear and instinct driving her forward before caution could catch up. The door, against every expectation, was unlocked. She pushed it open and found Alexander inside, on his knees before a dressing table covered in a fine layer of dust, his hands pressed over his face, his shoulders shaking with a grief so violent it had torn that terrible sound from somewhere deep inside him. "Your Grace." He looked up at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ashcombe Hall, she saw him with every wall stripped away, his eyes red and wild, his composure utterly shattered. Around him, the room told its own story without need of words. A woman's gown still hung in the open wardrobe, faded now with years of neglect. A silver hairbrush lay on the dressing table exactly where it had been set down, undisturbed, waiting for a hand that would never lift it again. This was Charlotte's room, preserved precisely as she had left it, sealed away from time itself. "You should not be here," he said, his voice raw and broken. "No one is permitted here. No one. I heard you cry out. I could not simply walk away. You should have." He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, and turned away from her to face the shuttered window, his back rigid with the effort of rebuilding walls that had just crumbled entirely in front of a witness. "This is not a room for strangers to see. I am not trying to invade your grief, Alexander." His given name slipped from her before she could stop it, and she saw his shoulders tense further at the sound of it, though he did not correct her. "I only want to understand, please. Whatever happened here, whatever you are carrying alone, you do not have to carry it in complete silence forever." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "You do not know what you are asking to understand. Then tell me. Let me understand it properly, rather than piecing it together from rumors and silences that only make it worse." He turned back to face her, and something in his expression had shifted, some barrier finally giving way beneath the weight of years spent holding it in place alone. Charlotte was to be my wife, he said. We were 3 weeks from our wedding when she disappeared. Disappeared how? She went walking near the cliffs above the village, as she often did in the evenings. She never returned. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and Eleanor could see the effort it cost him to continue speaking at all. They searched for a fortnight. The entire village turned out, day after day, along every stretch of coastline for miles. They found nothing, no trace of her, no answer as to whether she fell, or was taken, or simply chose to walk away from a life she had grown to dread. Nothing at all, except silence, and speculation, and a village full of people who looked at me afterward as though I might have been responsible. Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle over her like a physical thing. Do you believe you were responsible? I believe I will never know the answer, and that not knowing has become its own particular kind of punishment. His voice cracked on the final word, and he turned away from her again, unable to hold her gaze. The second cup, Miss Hart, since you have wondered about it since your very first morning in this house. It is set for her. Every single day, as though she might yet walk through that door and take her place at my table, and I will not have grown so cowardly in her absence that I stopped believing she might. The confession hung between them, fragile and enormous all at once. Eleanor did not know what to say, did not know what words could possibly answer a grief that had reshaped an entire household around its silence for 3 long years. So she said nothing, and instead crossed the room and stood beside him, close enough that he could feel her presence without being forced to look at her, offering the only comfort she could think to give. You do not have to explain further tonight, she said quietly, but I am glad you told me. I do not think silence has served you as well as everyone in this house seems to believe. He turned to look at her then, and something passed between them in that shared glance, something neither of them was prepared to name aloud, though Eleanor felt it settle into her chest with a warmth that frightened her more than any secret the house had yet revealed. I have not spoken of that night to anyone in 3 years, he said, not to Margaret, not to Henry, not even to Edmund, who demands answers about everything else concerning this family. He shook his head slowly, wonder mixing with exhaustion in his expression. Why is it that a stranger who has known me barely a fortnight is the first person I have managed to tell? Perhaps because I asked the question everyone else was too afraid to ask, Eleanor said softly. Sometimes the people closest to us are too careful with our pain to help us carry it properly. He studied her for a long moment, something unguarded and searching in his gaze, before finally nodding, as if her answer had settled something within him he had not realized needed settling. You should return to your quarters, Miss Hart. It grows late, and I have kept you from your rest with matters that are not truly yours to carry. I do not mind carrying them, if it helps. The words left her before she had fully considered them, and she saw the way they landed, saw something shift behind his eyes that looked almost like hope, quickly suppressed beneath years of careful restraint. Go to bed, he said, though his voice had softened considerably from its earlier sharpness. We will speak no further of this tonight. She left the room reluctantly, glancing back once to see him still standing amid Charlotte's preserved belongings, his silhouette outlined against the shuttered window, a man caught permanently between mourning and moving forward, unable to fully commit to either. The following morning, Eleanor arrived early to set the breakfast table, her mind still turning over everything she had learned the night before. She found Margaret already there, standing perfectly still before the 2 cups, an expression of quiet alarm on her weathered face. You went into the east wing last night, Margaret said, not looking up from the table. Henry heard you on the stairs afterward. He recognized your step. I did not intend for it to become known. It is my business to know everything that happens in this house, Miss Hart, whether or not it is intended for my ears. Margaret finally looked at her, and to Eleanor's surprise, there was no anger in her expression, only a deep, tired concern. What did he tell you? Everything, I believe. About Charlotte, about the search, about why he sets that second cup every morning. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting to the empty place setting across from the Duke's usual chair. In 3 years, he has never spoken of that night to a single living soul in this house, not fully. Not with the details you now carry. She shook her head slowly, something like wonder crossing her weathered features. I do not know whether to be relieved that he has finally said the words aloud, or frightened of what it means that he chose to say them to you, of all people, after so short an acquaintance. What do you mean, frightened? Margaret hesitated, choosing her words with obvious care. I mean that grief left unspoken for long enough begins to calcify, Miss Hart. It becomes a shell a person builds around themselves for protection. When that shell finally cracks, When a man like His Grace finally allows himself to feel what he has spent years refusing to feel, the aftermath can be unpredictable. I have seen it before, in other houses, with other men who lost the people they loved most. Sometimes it leads to healing, and sometimes it leads to something far more dangerous. I do not understand. You will, perhaps in time. Margaret set the final teacup in its place with careful precision, her expression grave. Only be careful, Miss Hart. Whatever is beginning between you and His Grace, and do not think I have failed to notice it, you are stepping into waters far deeper and far more dangerous than you likely realize. There are people in this county who would not welcome the Duke of Ashcombe finding happiness again, particularly not with someone so far beneath his station. And there are questions about that night on the cliffs that have never truly been answered. Questions that some among us fear may yet resurface, whether we wish them to or not. The warning settled over Eleanor with a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air drifting through the open window. She thought of Lord Edmund's calculating gaze, of his thinly veiled threat concerning gossip and reputation, and wondered for the first time whether the mystery surrounding Charlotte's disappearance might involve more than simple tragedy after all. She set the final napkin in its place and stepped back from the table, studying the 2 cups that had haunted her curiosity since her very first morning in this house. She understood now what they meant, understood the grief and the guilt and the desperate, aching hope that kept the ritual alive year after year. But understanding the meaning behind the cups had not answered every question. It had only revealed how many more remained hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, whether Ashcombe Hall was ready for that reckoning or not. 3 days passed before Eleanor found the courage to return to the East Wing alone. She told herself it was simply duty, that dust needed clearing and windows needed airing in every room of the house, including the ones the family preferred to forget. But standing once again before the door to Charlotte's chamber, her candle flickering against the gloom of the empty corridor, she knew the excuse for what it was. She wanted to understand the woman behind the mystery, not merely the shape of her absence. The room looked different in daylight, filtered thin through gaps in the shutters, less like a shrine to grief, and more like a life simply paused mid-motion. Eleanor moved carefully among Charlotte's belongings, touching nothing at first, only looking. A shelf of books, their spines cracked from use rather than neglect. A small writing desk in the corner, its surface bare except for a dried inkwell, and a single drawer that Eleanor, after a long moment of hesitation, finally decided to open. Inside lay a leather journal, its pages soft with age, and a bundle of letters tied together with faded ribbon. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the journal free, aware of how deeply she was trespassing, yet unable to stop herself from opening the cover. The early entries were unremarkable, the ordinary thoughts of a young woman preparing for marriage, notes about wedding preparations, small observations about village life, occasional lines of quiet affection for Alexander that made Eleanor's chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to jealousy. But the final entries, dated only days before Charlotte's disappearance, read differently. The handwriting grew tighter, more hurried, as though written in haste or distress. "I cannot tell A what I have learned," one entry read. He would confront E directly, and I fear what that confrontation might bring. I must speak with someone before the wedding, someone who can advise me properly. I am meeting them Thursday evening, near the Eastern Path. I pray I am wrong about what I suspect, though every instinct tells me I am not. There were no further entries after that one. The remaining pages of the journal sat blank, waiting for words that had never come. Eleanor sat frozen for a long moment, the implications of what she had read settling over her with cold, creeping certainty. Charlotte had suspected something, some secret involving a person whose name began with E, someone dangerous enough that she feared confronting them directly. And she had gone to meet that person on the very evening she vanished from the cliffs above the village, never to return. E. Edmund. The thought arrived with a chill that made Eleanor glance instinctively toward the door, as though the very act of thinking his name might summon Lord Edmund into the room beside her. She thought of his calculating gaze during his visit, his thinly veiled threats, his obvious hunger for a title and estate that would only pass to him should Alexander remain without an heir. If Charlotte had discovered something about Edmund before her disappearance, something significant enough to warrant a secret meeting rather than open confrontation, it was not difficult to imagine why that meeting might have ended in tragedy rather than resolution. Eleanor carefully returned the journal to its drawer, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had uncovered. She could not bring this to Alexander directly, not without more certainty than a handful of cryptic sentences written by a frightened woman years before. To raise such an accusation against his own cousin without proof would only cause him further pain, and possibly danger, should Edmund learn that his secret, whatever it was, had resurfaced after so many years of careful silence. But neither could she simply forget what she had read. She left the room as carefully as she had entered it, closing the door softly behind her, and made her way back through the darkened corridor with new purpose settling alongside her fear. If the village still held memories of that final evening, memories that might confirm or deny what Charlotte's journal seemed to suggest, then Eleanor intended to find them, whatever the cost of that search might eventually prove to be. As she descended the main staircase, lost in thought, she nearly collided with a figure emerging from the shadows near the landing. She caught her breath sharply, expecting Margaret or Henry, and found instead a young footman named Peter, one of the newer additions to the household staff, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you were in the east wing again. I saw the candlelight beneath the door as I passed. I was airing the room, nothing more." Of course, he did not sound entirely convinced, though he made no move to challenge her further. "Only, Lord Edmund's carriage was seen on the road near the village yesterday, though he sent no word ahead announcing another visit. I thought you should know, given how closely you seem to be looking into matters that concern him." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her. "Thank you for telling me, Peter." He nodded once and continued down the corridor, leaving her alone with the uncomfortable realization that she was not the only person in this house paying close attention to who moved where and why. Whatever answers waited for her in the village, she would need to tread far more carefully than she had anticipated, for it seemed increasingly likely that she was no longer the only one watching the shadows of Ashcombe Hall for signs of a truth that someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to keep buried. A hand closed around Eleanor's wrist the moment she stepped off the village path, pulling her sharply behind the shelter of a stone wall before she could even cry out in alarm. "Quiet!" a woman's voice hissed. "Unless you want every eye in this village turned toward you." Eleanor's heart pounded as she found herself face to face with an older woman she did not recognize, weathered and sharp-eyed, dressed in the plain wool of a farmer's wife. The woman released her wrist but kept her voice low, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder toward the small crowd gathered near the market stalls. "Forgive me for startling you," the woman said, "but you are the new housekeeper from Ashcombe Hall, are you not? I saw you asking questions of the miller's boy not 10 minutes ago. Questions about Charlotte Ainsworth. I meant no harm by it. Perhaps not, but there are people in this village who do not welcome that name being spoken aloud, and they are not always so gentle as I am in expressing their displeasure." The woman studied her for a long moment, something like sympathy softening her guarded expression. "My name is Ruth. I kept house for the Ainsworth family for nearly 10 years, before Charlotte disappeared and her parents could no longer bear to remain in this county. I have not spoken of that time to anyone in years, but something in your face tells me you are asking these questions for reasons beyond idle curiosity." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before deciding to trust her instincts. "I believe Charlotte discovered something before she disappeared, something concerning a person whose name began with the letter E. I found her journal, hidden in her old room at the estate, and the final entries suggest she feared confronting this person directly." Ruth's face went pale beneath its weathered lines. She glanced around once more before answering, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "You should not have found that journal. I helped pack away her belongings myself all those years ago, and I made certain that journal was placed somewhere it would never be found. His Grace could not have borne reading it, not in the state he was in." "You knew about the entries then? About what she suspected?" "I knew enough to be frightened." Ruth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the afternoon was mild. "Charlotte came to me, the week before she vanished, in a state of great distress. She told me she had discovered financial records suggesting that Lord Edmund had been systematically diverting funds meant for the estate's tenants, funds His Grace had entrusted to his cousin's management while he attended to matters in the city. She feared what might happen to those tenant families already struggling, if the theft continued unchecked. Why did she not simply bring this information to Alexander directly? She intended to eventually, but she was young and gentle by nature, and she feared the damage such an accusation might cause between cousins who had been close since childhood, whatever their differences as grown men. She wanted proof first, something undeniable, before she brought such a serious charge to her betrothed. She arranged to meet someone who managed the tenant accounts, a clerk from the village who could confirm or deny her suspicions with the actual ledgers in hand. Eleanor felt a cold certainty settling over her, and that meeting took place on the eastern path, the same evening she disappeared. Ruth nodded slowly, her eyes bright with old grief. The clerk she was meant to meet, a quiet man named Nathaniel Cross, never arrived that evening. He claimed later he had been delayed by illness, though I never fully believed the excuse. Charlotte went to the meeting point alone and never returned. I have wondered, every single day since, whether Lord Edmund learned of her suspicions somehow, and ensured that meeting never took place as intended. Do you believe he harmed her? I believe I do not know, and that not knowing has haunted this village nearly as much as it has haunted the man who loved her. Ruth's expression grew troubled. There were searches, of course, extensive ones, covering every stretch of coastline for miles. But the cliffs near that path are treacherous, full of hidden currents below, and it is entirely possible she simply lost her footing in the fading light, frightened and distracted by what she had learned, with no foul play involved at all. I have never been able to decide which possibility troubles me more, an accident born of her own fear, or something far more deliberate arranged by a man who stood to gain everything from her silence. Eleanor absorbed this information with a growing sense of dread, thinking of Lord Edmund's calculating gaze during his visit to the estate, his obvious hunger for the title and lands that would only pass to him should Alexander remain without an heir of his own. If Charlotte had discovered evidence of his theft, and if that evidence had somehow led to her disappearance, then Edmund's presence in Alexander's life represented a danger far greater than simple family tension. Does this clerk still live in the village, Nathaniel Cross? Ruth's expression grew guarded again. He did, the last I knew, though he keeps to himself these days, rarely seen beyond his own small cottage at the edge of the woods. Whether he would speak to you about that evening, I could not say. Some wounds closed themselves off entirely, rather than healing. Would you tell me where to find him? Ruth studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind her careful eyes. You care for him, don't you, the Duke? The question caught Eleanor entirely off guard, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks before she could master her expression into something more neutral. I care about the truth being uncovered, for his sake as much as for Charlotte's memory. That is not quite the same answer as denying my question. A faint, knowing smile touched Ruth's weathered face, though it faded quickly beneath the weight of old sorrow. Very well. I will tell you where to find Nathaniel's cottage, though I warn you to tread carefully. Whatever happened that evening on the cliffs, someone in this county has kept that secret buried for 3 long years, and buried secrets do not always welcome being disturbed, however good the intentions of the person doing the disturbing. Following Ruth's careful directions, Eleanor made her way through the edge of the village toward a small, isolated cottage nestled among the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, suggesting someone was home, though the shuttered windows and overgrown garden path spoke of a man who preferred solitude to company. Her knock went unanswered for a long moment, before the door finally opened a cautious crack, revealing a thin, gray-haired man with nervous, darting eyes that studied her with obvious suspicion. I do not receive visitors, he said, already moving to close the door again. Please, my name is Eleanor Hart, and I work at Ashcombe Hall. I need to ask you about the evening Charlotte Ainsworth disappeared. The color drained entirely from Nathaniel's face. For a moment Eleanor feared he would simply shut the door in her face and refuse to speak further, but something in her steady, patient expression seemed to give him pause. He glanced nervously past her shoulder, as though checking whether she had been followed, before finally stepping back to allow her inside. The cottage's interior was cramped but tidy, a single room dominated by a small hearth and a table cluttered with old ledgers that Nathaniel hurried to gather and put away, though not quickly enough to prevent Eleanor from noticing the careful columns of figures that filled their pages. I was meant to meet her that evening, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, once he had settled into a chair across from her with obvious reluctance. She wished to see the tenant account records, to confirm suspicions she had developed about how funds were being managed. I agreed to bring the relevant ledgers to the eastern path, away from prying eyes at the estate. But you never arrived. I was frightened away. He rubbed his hands together nervously, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on Eleanor's face. That very morning, Lord Edmund visited my home unannounced. He said nothing directly about Charlotte or our planned meeting, but he made clear, in careful and menacing terms, that certain clerks who valued their continued livelihood would be wise to keep their noses out of matters that did not concern them. I understood the warning for exactly what it was. I did not go to that meeting. I have carried the guilt of that decision every single day since, wondering whether my absence contributed somehow to whatever befell her. Did you ever report this to anyone, to the authorities investigating her disappearance? Nathaniel's laugh held no humor at all. Report what, precisely? A vague threat with no witnesses beyond myself? Lord Edmund is a powerful man, Miss Hart, with powerful connections throughout this county. I had a family to protect, and no proof beyond suspicion that could withstand his denial. I chose silence, and I have lived with that choice ever since, though it has never once felt like peace. Eleanor left the cottage a short while later with her mind reeling from everything she had learned. the pieces of a 3-year-old mystery finally beginning to assemble themselves into a shape far darker than simple tragedy. Charlotte had uncovered evidence of theft. She had arranged to confirm that evidence through a clerk who had been frightened into silence by the very man whose secret she threatened to expose. And on the evening she went to meet him, alone and unaware that he would never arrive, something had happened on those treacherous cliffs that no one, in 3 long years, had ever managed to fully explain. Whether accident or something far more deliberate, Lord Edmund Whitmore had motive, opportunity, and a demonstrated willingness to silence anyone who threatened to expose him. And Eleanor now carried knowledge dangerous enough that, should the wrong person learn she possessed it, she might find herself facing the very same fate that had claimed Charlotte Ainsworth 3 years before. She returned to Ashcombe Hall as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, uncertain how she would ever find the courage to bring such devastating suspicions to Alexander, and even more uncertain what those suspicions might mean for both their futures, should they prove to be true. The walk back along the coastal road gave her time to think, and with every step, the weight of what she had learned pressed more heavily against her chest. She found herself pausing near the eastern path, the very stretch of cliffs where Charlotte had last been seen, drawn there by some instinct she could not fully explain. The waves crashed far below against jagged rock, and the wind carried a chill that had nothing to do with the mild autumn air. Standing there, staring out at the water, Eleanor tried to imagine what those final moments must have been like. A young woman, frightened by what she had uncovered, waiting alone in the fading light for a meeting that would never take place. Had she sensed danger before it arrived? Had she simply grown impatient and turned back toward the village, only to lose her footing on the uneven path in the growing dark? Or had someone else been waiting there instead? Someone who could not afford to let her suspicions reach the man she loved. Eleanor shivered and stepped back from the edge, suddenly acutely aware of how exposed she was, alone on this same isolated stretch of path where a woman had vanished without explanation. She quickened her pace back toward the estate, glancing occasionally over her shoulder, though she saw no one following. When she finally arrived at Ashcombe Hall, dusk had settled fully over the grounds, and she found Margaret waiting near the servants' entrance with obvious relief written across her weathered face. "You have been gone the entire afternoon," Margaret said, ushering her quickly inside. "I was beginning to fear something had happened to you. I am sorry to have worried you. I lost track of the time." Margaret studied her closely, taking in her flushed cheeks and the barely contained tension in her posture. "Something has happened. I can see it in your face, Miss Hart. What did you learn in the village?" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal even to someone she had come to trust. But the weight of the secret felt too heavy to carry entirely alone, and she found herself recounting a careful version of her conversation with Ruth, omitting Nathaniel's name and exact location, but sharing enough of the substance to convey the gravity of what she now suspected. Margaret's face grew increasingly pale as she listened, her hands twisting anxiously in her apron. "You must be careful, Eleanor. If what you suspect is true, if Lord Edmund truly bears responsibility for whatever happened to Charlotte, then he is not a man who will hesitate to protect that secret by whatever means necessary. You have already drawn his attention once, during his visit. I do not think it wise to draw it further without absolute certainty and proof strong enough to withstand his denial." "Then what would you have me do? Say nothing, and allow him to continue believing his secret remains safely buried?" "I would have you proceed with far greater caution than you have shown thus far," Margaret said firmly, though her eyes carried more worry than reproach. "Speak with his grace, yes, but choose your moment carefully, and consider what proof you might gather before making such a serious accusation against his own family. Grief has already broken this house once. I would not see it broken again by suspicion alone, without the certainty needed to see justice properly served." Eleanor nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in the older woman's caution, even as impatience burned beneath her careful composure. Whatever the right path forward might be, she understood now that she could not simply retreat into silence, not with so much at stake for a man who had finally begun to trust her with the truth of his own grief. The question that remained was how, and when, and at what cost, she would finally bring that truth fully into the light. The ledger struck the study desk with a sound like a gunshot, and Alexander's head snapped up from his papers, startled by the sudden violence of the gesture. "What is the meaning of this, Miss Hart?" Eleanor stood before him, her hands trembling with the effort of finally forcing the words out after days of careful deliberation. "It means, Your Grace, that I can no longer stay silent about what I have learned, whatever the cost of speaking might prove to be." She had spent 3 sleepless nights weighing Margaret's caution against her own growing conviction that silence, however careful, had already cost this family too much. In the end, it was not proof that finally drove her to act. but a moment of near disaster that made clear the danger of waiting any longer. She had been descending the main staircase that very morning when a loose stone step, one that had never before shown any sign of weakness, had crumbled beneath her foot without warning, sending her tumbling nearly the full length of the staircase before she managed to catch the railing and save herself from serious injury. An accident, perhaps. But coming so soon after her visit to the village, she could not convince herself it was mere coincidence. Now she stood before him with the tenant account ledger she had managed to borrow from Nathaniel, the frightened clerk having finally agreed, after much persuasion, to lend her the evidence he had kept hidden for 3 long years. "Explain yourself," Alexander said, his voice carrying a warning edge she had not heard from him since her very first morning in this house. "I believe Lord Edmund has been stealing from the tenant funds for years, funds you entrusted to his management while you attended to matters elsewhere. I believe Charlotte discovered this theft before her disappearance, and that she arranged to meet a clerk who could confirm her suspicions with these very records. I believe that clerk was threatened into silence and never arrived at their meeting, and that Charlotte went alone to the eastern path that evening, into circumstances that may not have been the simple accident everyone has assumed for 3 years." The color drained entirely from Alexander's face. He rose from his desk slowly, as though his legs had suddenly forgotten how to properly support him, and crossed to where she stood, taking the ledger from her hands with fingers that visibly trembled. "You believe Edmund harmed her. I believe he had reason to want her silenced and the means to arrange it, whether directly or through fear pressed upon others who might have helped her otherwise. I cannot prove what happened on those cliffs that evening. No one may ever be able to prove it fully. But I can prove the theft, Alexander, and I believe that proof alone deserves to see the light of day, regardless of what else it might ultimately reveal." He opened the ledger with shaking hands, scanning the careful columns of figures that Eleanor had already studied at length during her long walk back from the village. She watched his expression shift through disbelief, then horror, then something colder and more dangerous, as understanding finally settled fully into place. "These figures span nearly 4 years," he said quietly. "Thousands of pounds, diverted from tenant improvements, from repairs to their cottages, from the very funds meant to keep families in this county from falling into ruin. All while I trusted him completely, believed every report he gave me about the state of the estate's affairs." His hands tightened around the ledger's edges until his knuckles went white. "And you believe Charlotte discovered this before she died?" "I believe it, based on entries in her own journal, and based on what I have learned from people in the village who remember that time far more clearly than anyone here has been willing to speak of it." Alexander set the ledger down with careful, deliberate control, though Eleanor could see the effort that control demanded of him. "Show me this journal." They made their way together to the east wing, and for the first time since Eleanor had discovered it, Alexander opened the drawer of Charlotte's writing desk himself, his hands hesitating only briefly before lifting the leather journal free. He read the final entries in silence, his jaw tightening with every line, and when he finally looked up, his eyes carried a devastation that went far beyond simple grief. "She was afraid," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "She was afraid, and alone, and she never came to me with what she had discovered because she feared what confronting my own cousin might do to our family, to me. And I spent 3 years believing I had simply lost her to some cruel accident of fate, never once suspecting that someone in my own household might bear responsibility. You could not have known. I should have known." His voice rose sharply, though the anger in it was clearly directed inward rather than at her. "I should have paid closer attention to the accounts myself, rather than trusting Edmund so completely, simply because we shared blood and childhood memories together. I should have questioned why the tenant cottages continued to fall into disrepair, despite the funds I believed were being properly allocated toward their improvement. I have been so consumed by my own grief these past 3 years that I failed to see what was happening directly beneath my own roof. You were mourning the woman you loved, Alexander. That is not a failure. That is simply what grief does to a person, when it is given no proper outlet for release." He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded passing across his features, and the space between them seemed to close, inch by inch, without either of them consciously choosing to move closer. "You have given me more in these past weeks, Miss Hart, than I believed I was still capable of receiving from anyone. Answers I did not know I still needed, and a reason to feel something other than this endless, suffocating grief that has defined every single day since I lost her. Alexander." "I know it is not proper," he said quickly, before she could finish whatever protest she had been about to voice. "I know the distance between our stations should prevent me from saying what I am about to say, but I find I no longer have the strength to pretend I do not feel what I feel, not after everything you have uncovered, not after everything you have risked to bring me this truth." He reached out, hesitant, and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin in a gesture so tender it stole the breath entirely from her lungs. I do not know what the coming days will bring, once this truth about Edmund becomes fully known. There will be confrontation, and likely scandal, and consequences I cannot fully predict, but I find that I do not wish to face any of it without you standing beside me, Eleanor, however improper that wish may be considered by the world beyond these walls. Eleanor's heart pounded fiercely against her ribs, torn between the fear of what such an admission might mean for both their futures, and a hope she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge until this very moment. I am only a housekeeper, Alexander. Whatever exists between us, however genuine it may feel in this room, tonight, the world beyond these walls will not see it so simply. Then let the world adjust its vision, he said, with a fierceness that surprised her. I have spent 3 years allowing the expectations of others, the weight of a title I never asked to inherit, to dictate every choice I made regarding my own heart. I will not continue making that same mistake now, not when I have finally found someone who sees me as a man first, rather than simply a title or a tragedy to be pitied. Before she could formulate any response to such an overwhelming declaration, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, and Henry appeared in the doorway, his weathered face pale with alarm. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Edmund has just arrived unannounced, and he is asking for you most urgently. He seems to know something has changed, though I cannot say how word could have reached him so quickly. Alexander's expression hardened immediately, the tenderness of the previous moment replaced by cold, controlled fury. Where is he now? In the drawing room, Your Grace. Though I confess his manner is unlike anything I have witnessed from him before. He seems frightened, rather than his usual confident self. Alexander glanced once more at Eleanor, something passing between them that felt like both promise and warning combined. Stay here, he said quietly. Whatever is about to happen downstairs, I would rather you remain somewhere safe until I understand fully what Edmund knows, and how he came to know it. Alexander, if he suspects that we have discovered the truth about the accounts, there is no telling what he might. I know the risk, he said, cutting her off gently but firmly. That is precisely why I need you to remain here, out of harm's way, while I confront him directly. Please, Eleanor, trust me in this. She wanted desperately to argue, every instinct urging her to remain close to him rather than be shut away in another room while danger unfolded downstairs, but something in his expression, some quiet plea beneath the command, convinced her to relent, if only this once. Be careful, she said softly. He nodded once, then turned and strode from the room with a purposeful energy she had never witnessed from him before. The weight of 3 years of careful, controlled grief finally giving way to something far more dangerous. A man prepared, at last, to demand the truth from someone who had hidden behind family loyalty for far too long. Eleanor remained alone in Charlotte's preserved chamber, her heart still racing from everything that had passed between them. Uncertain whether the tremor in her hands came from fear of what Edmund's unexpected arrival might mean, or from the overwhelming weight of the words Alexander had spoken just moments before Henry's interruption. Whatever confrontation was unfolding downstairs at this very moment, she understood with sudden, absolute clarity that the careful, quiet world of Ashcombe Hall was about to change irrevocably, and there would be no returning to the silence and secrecy that had defined this house for the past 3 years. She moved to the window, drawing back the shutter just enough to glimpse the courtyard below, where Edmund's carriage sat waiting, its driver pacing anxiously beside the horses as though anticipating a hasty departure. Whatever conversation was taking place inside the drawing room, it seemed even Edmund's own household staff sensed that this visit would not end as calmly as his previous ones had. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cold glass and waited, every nerve in her body strained toward the distant sound of raised voices she could just barely make out echoing up through the old house's ancient walls, praying that whatever truth was being spoken downstairs would not come at a cost too great for either of them to bear. Unable to bear the waiting any longer, she finally left the chamber and made her way quietly down the back staircase, drawn by the same stubborn instinct that had guided her toward the east wing weeks before. She positioned herself near the drawing room door, close enough to hear, careful to remain out of sight. You have no proof of anything, Edmund was saying, his usual polished confidence noticeably absent from his voice. Whatever your housekeeper claims to have found, it is nothing more than a servant's overactive imagination, fed by village gossip and old grief that has clearly clouded your judgment. The tenant ledgers do not lie, Edmund. Nathaniel Cross has already confirmed the discrepancies, and he is prepared to testify to them, should it become necessary. Alexander's voice carried a controlled fury that Eleanor had never heard from him before. 4 years of theft, disguised beneath careful reports and falsified accounts. Tenant families going without proper repairs, while you diverted their funds toward your own comfort. And Charlotte discovered it, didn't she? She discovered it, and she meant to confront you. And now she is gone, and I am left wondering exactly what role you played in ensuring she never had the chance. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the sound of Edmund's uneven breathing. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost all its earlier bravado, reduced instead to something desperate and pleading. I never meant for her to come to harm, Alexander. You must believe that much, whatever else you choose to believe about me. I only meant to frighten her into silence, the same as I frightened that clerk. I never imagined she would go to the cliffs alone that evening, waiting for a meeting that would never take place. When she did not return, when the searches began and turned up nothing, I told myself it was simply a terrible accident, unconnected to anything I had done. I told myself that for 3 years, because the alternative was more than I could bear to face. You threatened her. Alexander's voice had gone dangerously quiet, more frightening in its restraint than any shout could have been. You threatened the woman I was going to marry, frightened her into facing that danger alone, and then you stood beside me at her memorial service, offering false comfort, while knowing full well what role you had played in bringing us to that moment. What would you have had me do? Confess to theft that would have seen me stripped of everything, disgraced before the entire county, simply to ease your grief over a woman who might have died regardless, through pure accident and nothing more? Some of Edmund's old arrogance returned, defensive and ugly beneath the fear. I have spent 3 years living beside my own guilt, Alexander. Do not imagine I have escaped this unscathed, whatever comfort my silence may have purchased me. Your guilt does not restore what your greed and cowardice have cost this family. Alexander's voice carried absolute finality now. You will return every pound you have stolen from these tenant accounts, in full, beginning immediately. You will resign any claim to inheritance you believe you hold over this estate. And you will leave this county before nightfall, Edmund, and never return. Or I will see to it that the full truth of your actions, theft and threats both, becomes known to every magistrate and every family in this region who might otherwise have trusted you. And if I refuse? Then you will discover exactly how far I am willing to go to see justice finally served, both for Charlotte's memory and for every tenant family your greed has harmed these past 4 years. Do not test me on this matter, Edmund. I have spent 3 years being gentle with my grief. I find I have very little patience left for gentleness where you are concerned. Eleanor heard the scrape of a chair, followed by hurried footsteps crossing the drawing-room floor. She stepped back quickly from the doorway, retreating into the shadows of the corridor just as Edmund emerged, his face pale and stricken, his earlier confidence utterly destroyed. He did not notice her standing in the shadows. He simply strode past, out through the main entrance. And moments later she heard his carriage pulling away down the long drive at considerably greater speed than it had arrived. She found Alexander still standing in the drawing room, his shoulders heaving slightly with the effort of everything he had just confronted, his hands braced against the mantel as though he needed its support to remain upright. She entered quietly, and he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression a complex mixture of exhaustion, grief, and something that looked almost like relief. "It is done," he said quietly. "He has confessed to the theft, and to threatening both Charlotte and Nathaniel, though he continues to insist her death was accidental, a tragedy he merely failed to prevent rather than directly caused. I do not know if I will ever have certainty enough to know the full truth of that evening, but I have truth enough now to see proper justice served for the tenants he wronged, if not fully for Charlotte herself." Eleanor crossed the room and took his hands in hers, offering silent comfort where words felt insufficient to the moment. "You did what needed to be done, Alexander. Whatever certainty remains beyond your reach, you have finally broken the silence that has held this house captive for 3 long years." He looked down at their joined hands, then up into her eyes, and something in his expression settled, as though a great weight had finally begun to lift after years of pressing down upon him without relief. "I could not have found the courage for any of this without you," he said softly. "You arrived in this house asking a question no one else dared to ask, and in doing so, you gave me back a version of myself I feared I had lost entirely." The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility, and Eleanor understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever challenges still lay ahead, the truth had finally been spoken, and Ashcombe Hall would never return to the careful, guarded silence that had defined it for so long. The invitation arrived on cream paper edged in gold, and the moment Margaret read the name inscribed upon it, her face went rigid with alarm. "The Marquis of Halsworth requests the pleasure of the Duke of Ashcombe's company at a ball celebrating his daughter's introduction to society," she read aloud, then looked up at Eleanor with obvious concern. This is precisely the match Lord Edmund spoke of during his visit. It seems word of Edmund's disgrace has not yet reached every corner of the county, or perhaps the Marquis simply does not care, so long as a duke's title remains attached to his daughter's future. 3 weeks had passed since Edmund's confession and hasty departure from the county. In that time, Alexander had worked tirelessly to restore what had been stolen from the tenant families, personally overseeing repairs to cottages that had been neglected for years, and quietly settling matters with the magistrate in a manner that avoided public scandal, while still ensuring proper restitution was made. The estate itself had begun to feel different, lighter somehow, as though the truth finally spoken aloud had lifted a weight from every room within its walls. But Eleanor had not failed to notice the way certain members of the household staff now watched her with new wariness, nor the careful distance Alexander had maintained between them since that charged moment in the drawing room. He had not withdrawn his affection exactly, but something had shifted, a caution settling over him that she suspected sprang from fear rather than any change of heart. She found him later that evening in his study, the golden invitation lying unopened upon his desk, his expression distant as he stared at nothing in particular. "You intend to attend," she said, not quite a question. He looked up, startled from his thoughts. "I have not yet decided. Margaret tells me the Marquis has a daughter of marriageable age, a sensible match, I believe Edmund once called it, though I doubt his opinion carries much weight in this house any longer." Something flickered across Alexander's face, guilt mixed with uncertainty. "Eleanor, you must understand the pressures that come with a title such as mine. The family name requires an heir, the estate requires stability that only a proper marriage, sanctioned by society, can truly provide. I have spent these past weeks trying to find some way to reconcile what I feel for you with what duty demands of me, and I confess I have found no easy answer." The words landed like a physical blow, though Eleanor kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to let him see how deeply they had wounded her. "I see. Do not misunderstand me. What I feel for you is not something I take lightly, nor something I wish to simply set aside because society demands it." He rose from his desk and crossed to where she stood, though he stopped short of touching her, as though uncertain he still held the right to do so. "But I have already brought scandal enough to this family through Edmund's exposure. I fear what further scandal might follow, should I choose to marry so far beneath my station, particularly so soon after such public upheaval." "Then perhaps you should attend the Marquis's ball," Eleanor said quietly, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the ache spreading through her chest. "Perhaps that is truly the wiser path forward, whatever either of us might wish otherwise." She turned and left the study before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes, retreating to the privacy of her small room beneath the eaves, where she allowed herself, finally, to weep for a future she had allowed herself to hope for far too readily. The days that followed passed in careful, painful politeness between them. Alexander prepared for the ball with visible reluctance, while Eleanor threw herself into her duties with a fervor that left little time for reflection, though the ache in her chest never fully subsided no matter how busy she kept her hands. Margaret watched the growing distance between them with obvious sympathy, though she offered no easy comfort, understanding as well as anyone the impossible weight of expectation that governed a man in Alexander's position. The evening of the ball arrived with a cold, driving rain that seemed to match Eleanor's mood entirely. She helped dress Alexander for the occasion with hands that trembled slightly, adjusting his cravat with careful precision, while refusing to meet his eyes for longer than duty required. "Eleanor," he said softly, as she finished the final adjustment, "I need you to know that whatever happens tonight, whatever I say or do not say to the Marquis and his daughter, it changes nothing about what I feel in my own heart. I only wish I possessed enough courage to act upon those feelings, without fear of the consequences they might bring upon everyone I am responsible for protecting. I understand duty, Your Grace." Her use of his formal title, rather than his given name, seemed to strike him like a physical blow. "I have understood it my entire life. You need not explain yourself further to me." He looked as though he wished to say more, but the carriage had already arrived, and duty, as always, won out over whatever words remained unspoken between them. Eleanor watched from the window as he departed into the driving rain, and told herself firmly that this ache in her chest would fade with time, though some deeper part of her did not quite believe it. At the Marquis's grand estate many miles away, Alexander stood at the edge of a glittering ballroom, surrounded by candlelight and music and the practiced laughter of a society he had once belonged to easily, before grief had carved him into someone quieter and more guarded. The Marquis's daughter, a pleasant young woman named Charlotte Wren, entirely unrelated to his lost betrothed despite the coincidence of her name, approached him with a polite curtsy and every expectation of a pleasant evening's conversation. "Your Grace," she said warmly. "I confess I have heard a great deal about Ashcombe Hall. They say it is among the finest estates in the county, though rarely open to visitors these past years." "It has been a quiet house," Alexander admitted, offering her the courtesy of his attention, though his mind remained elsewhere entirely. "Though I find of late that its quiet has begun to feel more like peace than sorrow." "That is good to hear. My father speaks highly of the improvements you have made to your tenant properties this season. Generous, and rather unusual, for a man in your position to attend to such matters so personally." "I had good reason to attend to them personally," he said, thinking of Eleanor's steady conviction the night she had first laid the ledger before him. "Someone reminded me that duty to those who depend upon us matters a great deal more than duty to appearances alone." Miss Wren studied him with open curiosity. "You speak as though someone in particular taught you that lesson." "Someone did," Alexander said, and found himself unable to suppress the small, involuntary smile that rose at the thought of her. "Someone who asked me a question 3 months ago that I had spent years avoiding, and in doing so, gave me back a version of myself I feared I had lost entirely." The Marquess himself approached moments later, steering the conversation toward matters of alliance and inheritance, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to arranging his daughter's future advantageously. Alexander listened politely, offered careful non-committal answers, and found his gaze drifting repeatedly toward the ballroom's tall windows, beyond which lay the dark road leading back toward Ashcombe Hall, and toward the one person he found he could not stop thinking about, however dazzling the company surrounding him. By the time the orchestra began its third dance of the evening, Alexander understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity that he could not continue standing in this glittering room, performing the role expected of him, while the truth of his own heart waited many miles away, likely believing itself unwanted. He made his excuses to the Marquess as gracefully as circumstances allowed, ignoring the older man's visible confusion, and called for his carriage before the fourth dance had even begun. Hours passed slowly at Ashcombe Hall, the household settling into its usual evening quiet, while its master attended a ball meant to determine the shape of his future. Eleanor busied herself with mending in the small sitting room near the kitchen, though her needle moved without any real attention, her mind fixed entirely on the events unfolding many miles away. It was nearing midnight when the sound of a carriage arriving at full speed startled her from her thoughts. She hurried to the window in time to see Alexander himself, still in his formal evening attire, leaping down from the carriage before it had fully stopped and striding toward the house with an urgency that immediately set her heart racing. She met him in the main hall, rein still clinging to his shoulders, his eyes bright with something she could not immediately name. "Alexander, what has happened? Has something gone wrong?" "I could not do it," he said, breathless from more than simply the journey home. "I stood in that ballroom, surrounded by everyone society believes I should want, Marquess's daughter, perfectly lovely, and perfectly suitable in every way that matters to people who care about such things, and I felt nothing at all. Nothing but the absolute certainty that I was standing in the wrong room, wasting a night I should have spent telling you the truth I have been too afraid to speak plainly." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, hope warring fiercely with the caution she had built around her heart these past difficult days. "Alexander, I love you," he said, the words spilling out with a rawness that left no room for doubt. "I have loved you since that first morning you asked me a question no one else in this house dared to ask, and every day since has only deepened that love, whatever fear I allowed to keep me from admitting it aloud. I do not care what society expects of a man in my position. I do not care what whispers might follow us, or what judgments the Marquess and his kind might pass upon a duke who chooses his housekeeper over a proper match. I care only that I have spent 3 years living inside a grief so complete it nearly destroyed me, and you are the only person who has ever managed to bring me fully back to life." Tears spilled freely down Eleanor's cheeks now, joy replacing the ache that had settled there these past days. "I love you too, Alexander. I have loved you nearly as long, though I told myself it was foolish to hope for something so far beyond what I believed I deserved." He crossed the remaining distance between them and cupped her face gently in his hands, wiping away her tears with careful thumbs. "You deserve everything, Eleanor. You deserve a man brave enough to choose love over expectation, and I intend to spend every remaining day of my life proving myself worthy of the courage you showed me from that very first morning." He kissed her then, soft and tentative at first, then deepening with 3 years of loneliness and weeks of carefully restrained longing finally given full permission to express itself. When they finally parted, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, a smile transforming his features into something Eleanor suspected the household had not witnessed in years. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because duty demands it, or because an heir is required, but because I cannot imagine facing another single morning without you seated across from me at that table. Yes, Eleanor whispered, laughing through fresh tears. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Margaret was the first to learn of the engagement, and when Eleanor found her in the kitchen the following morning to share the news, the older woman's careful composure finally broke entirely, tears of genuine happiness gathering in her eyes as she embraced Eleanor without a trace of her usual formality. I hoped for this, Margaret admitted, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. From that very first morning, when you asked him about the cup and he looked at you as though no one had truly seen him in years, I hoped this house might finally learn to breathe again. I did not dare say so aloud for fear of hoping too much and being disappointed. You never once hinted at such hope, Margaret. You seemed nothing but cautious every time the subject arose. Caution and hope are not always opposites, Miss Hart. Sometimes the deepest hopes require the greatest caution, precisely because they matter so completely. Margaret squeezed her hands warmly. This house has needed joy for a very long time. I am glad it has finally found its way back to us, and gladder still that you are the one who brought it. Their engagement, when announced, did indeed provoke exactly the whispers and judgments Alexander had predicted, particularly among certain circles of society who believed a duke owed his title more than his heart. But Ashcombe Hall's tenants, who had witnessed firsthand the genuine care Eleanor brought to every aspect of the estate's daily life, and who had benefited directly from the restitution Alexander had ensured following Edmund's disgrace, welcomed the match with open warmth. Their wedding, held the following spring in the small village church where Alexander had spent so many lonely mornings praying for peace he never quite found, was a modest affair by aristocratic standards, though filled with more genuine joy than the grand society occasions that had once defined the Whitmore family's public life. On the morning after their wedding, Eleanor descended to the breakfast room to find Alexander already seated, the table set as it had been every single morning since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall. But this time, only one place setting occupied the space that had once held 2 cups, 2 plates, 2 folded napkins waiting faithfully for a guest who would never come. She paused in the doorway, understanding immediately what the change signified, and felt her chest tighten with an emotion too complex for simple words. Alexander looked up and met her eyes, something peaceful settling across his features that she had never witnessed during those early, grief-heavy mornings when she had first questioned the strange ritual that governed this house. I set the table myself this morning, he said quietly, rising to pull out the chair beside his own rather than across from it. I found that I no longer needed to preserve a place for someone who could never return, not when I finally have someone beside me who chooses, every single day, to stay. Eleanor crossed the room and took the seat he offered, close enough now that their hands could rest together upon the table between them. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the room in a way it had not felt warmed in years, and as she looked at her husband, finally at peace after 3 long years of carefully guarded grief, she understood that the mystery which had first drawn her curiosity that very first morning had led her, through danger and revelation both, to exactly where she was always meant to be. Charlotte's memory would remain honored, always, in the quiet corners of Alexander's heart, and in the small kindnesses he continued extending to the tenant families she had once tried so bravely to protect. But the second cup, the one that had waited faithfully through 3 years of unanswered mourning, no longer needed its place at their table. In its stead sat something Eleanor had never quite dared hope for during those uncertain early days at Ashcombe Hall, a love strong enough to break through years of careful silence, and a future finally allowed to begin. Before the festival that autumn, Eleanor had insisted on one final visit to the village, this time accompanied openly by Alexander, rather than undertaken in secret as her first journey there had been. They walked together to the small, isolated cottage at the edge of the woods, where Nathaniel Cross still lived in careful solitude, though word of Edmund's disgrace and departure had by then spread through every corner of the county. The former clerk answered his door with visible surprise, his nervous eyes widening further at the sight of the Duke himself standing beside the woman who had once sought him out for answers. "Your Grace," he stammered. "I did not expect. I have come to thank you," Alexander said simply, "for the courage you eventually found to share what you knew, however delayed that courage may have been, and to offer you a position, should you wish it, managing the very tenant accounts my cousin once corrupted so thoroughly. I believe a man who has carried the weight of silence as long as you have understands better than most the importance of honest record-keeping." Nathaniel's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I do not deserve such generosity, Your Grace, given how my silence may have contributed to what happened to Miss Ainsworth." "You were frightened by a powerful man who threatened your family's safety," Eleanor said gently. "That is not the same as guilt, Nathaniel. We have both learned, this past year, that fear and cowardice are not always the same thing, and that redemption remains possible for anyone willing to finally speak the truth, however long it has been buried. He accepted the position with humble gratitude, and within weeks had proven himself a scrupulously honest steward of the tenant funds, his careful, methodical nature, perfectly suited to ensuring nothing was ever again diverted from the families who depended upon it. Eleanor liked to think that Charlotte, wherever her memory now rested, would have approved of this particular resolution, a wrong finally righted through patient, careful justice rather than further tragedy. A year passed, and Ashcombe Hall bore little resemblance to the quiet, guarded house Eleanor had first entered as a stranger seeking only steady work and a roof over her head. The estate now hummed with a different kind of energy entirely. Tenant cottages that had once sagged under years of neglect stood freshly repaired, their gardens tended and their roofs sound against the coming winter. Children from the village, once kept carefully away from a house rumored to hold nothing but sorrow within its walls, now ran freely across the grounds during the harvest festival Eleanor had insisted on reviving, a tradition Alexander confessed had once been common in his own childhood before grief had closed the family off from such simple joys. Eleanor stood now at the edge of the festival grounds, watching Alexander laugh freely with a group of tenant children who had gathered to show him a game involving hoops and sticks, his formal reserve entirely abandoned in favor of genuine delight. It still occasionally startled her how completely he had transformed since that first difficult morning when she had dared to ask about a second cup of tea. The careful, guarded man consumed by silent grief had given way to someone lighter, someone capable of laughter that reached his eyes rather than remaining trapped somewhere behind them. "You are staring," came a familiar voice beside her, and she turned to find Margaret approaching, a basket of fresh bread balanced against her hip for the festival tables. "I cannot help it," Eleanor admitted, smiling. "I still find myself amazed, some days, at how different this house has become. You are the reason for that difference, whatever modesty might tempt you to claim otherwise." Margaret set down her basket and studied Eleanor with obvious affection. "How does married life suit you 6 months in?" "Better than I ever dared imagine, when I first arrived here with nothing but a single trunk and a letter of introduction." Eleanor's hand drifted, almost unconsciously, to rest against the slight curve of her stomach, a secret she had not yet shared even with Margaret, though she suspected the older woman's sharp eyes had already begun to notice. Margaret's gaze followed the gesture and her weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "Miss Hart, or rather, Your Grace, I suppose I must properly call you now, though the title still sits strangely on my tongue after everything we have shared together in this house." Her voice softened further. "Are congratulations in order beyond the marriage itself?" Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she could not suppress her own answering smile. "I have not yet told Alexander. I wish to be certain first, before offering him such news. Then I will keep your secret gladly, until you are ready to share it properly." Margaret squeezed her hand warmly. "Though I suspect, knowing him as I do now, that he will weep with joy the moment you tell him. He has waited a long time to imagine a future filled with more than simply enduring each day as it comes." That evening, once the festival had wound down and the last of the tenant families had made their way back toward the village with full stomachs and grateful hearts, Eleanor found Alexander in the garden behind the main house, standing near a small stone bench that had once belonged to his mother, watching the last light of sunset fade slowly toward darkness. "You seem thoughtful," she said, settling beside him on the bench. "I was thinking of Charlotte," he admitted, and though the name no longer carried the same raw devastation it once had, a quiet tenderness remained whenever he spoke of her. "Today, watching the children playing across grounds that have not seen such joy in years, I found myself wishing she could see what this house has become. I think she would be glad of it, however strange that thought might sound." "I do not find it strange at all," Eleanor said gently. "I think love, real love, wants happiness for the people it touches, even beyond its own ending. I do not believe honoring her memory, and building a new life together, were ever truly at odds with each other, whatever fear once convinced you otherwise." Alexander turned to study her in the fading light, something warm and settled in his gaze that had taken months to fully replace the careful guardedness she had first encountered. "You have given me more than I ever believed I deserved, Eleanor. A second chance at happiness. A restored sense of purpose in caring properly for the people who depend upon this estate, and a partner who challenges me to be better than the grief-worn man I had become before you arrived and ask the one question everyone else was too frightened to voice." "I have received just as much in return," Eleanor said softly. "A home when I believed I had lost any chance of finding one. A love I never expected to be offered, given how far my own circumstances had fallen before I arrived here. And a family, in you and in Margaret and in Henry. and in every tenant whose gratitude has become as much a part of my daily life as the work itself. She hesitated only a moment longer before finally sharing the secret she had carried these past weeks. There is something else I have received as well, Alexander, though I have only just become certain of it myself. His brow furrowed with gentle curiosity. What is it? She took his hand and placed it carefully against the slight curve of her stomach, watching understanding dawn slowly across his features, followed almost immediately by an overwhelming joy that broke through every remaining trace of the careful composure he had maintained even through their happiest months together. A child, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We are to have a child. Come spring, if my calculations are correct. He gathered her into his arms with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could have managed, and for a long moment they simply held each other beneath the darkening sky, the weight of years of grief, finally, fully transformed into something entirely new and hopeful. When he finally pulled back enough to look at her properly, tears of pure joy shone openly in his eyes, unashamed and unguarded in a way the man she had first met would never have permitted himself. I did not believe I would ever feel this again, he admitted quietly. This particular kind of happiness, the sort that fills every corner of a person, rather than merely visiting briefly before retreating again. I had convinced myself, during those years of mourning, that such feelings belonged only to my past, never to my future. And now? Now I understand that grief, however deep, does not have to be the final word on a person's story. It changes us, certainly. It leaves marks that never fully fade. But it need not be the only thing that defines the rest of our days. Not when we are brave enough to let new joy find its way in alongside the old sorrow. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then to her hand, then finally, softly, to her lips. Thank you, Eleanor, for teaching me that lesson, and for giving me a reason to believe it fully, rather than simply understanding it in theory. The following spring, their daughter arrived on a bright morning, much like the one that had first brought Eleanor to Ashcombe Hall as a stranger uncertain of her welcome. They named her Charlotte, a choice Alexander made without hesitation, and Eleanor embraced without a moment's reservation, understanding fully that honoring the past and building toward the future had never truly been separate paths, but rather two halves of the very same journey. On the morning of little Charlotte's christening, as the household gathered in celebration and the village church bells rang out clear and joyful across the estate grounds, Eleanor paused at the breakfast room doorway and looked once more at the table that had first drawn her curiosity so many months before. A single-place setting sat beside Alexander's, as it had every morning since their wedding, and beside it now stood a small chair, freshly made by the estate's carpenter, waiting for the day their daughter would grow old enough to join them properly at that same table. Whatever mystery had once surrounded that second cup, whatever grief and guilt had shaped the careful rituals of this house before her arrival, Eleanor understood now that every ending carried within it the quiet promise of a beginning, should those who lived through it prove brave enough to reach for it. She had asked one simple question on her very first morning at Ashcombe Hall, a question everyone else had been too afraid to voice, and that single moment of courage had led her, through danger and revelation and finally love, to exactly the life she had never quite dared to imagine for herself. The house that had once been defined entirely by silence now rang with laughter, with the small sounds of a growing family, with the steady rhythm of tenant gratitude and village celebration, and a love that had proven, in the end, far stronger than the grief that once threatened to consume it entirely. And every morning, without fail, 2 cups still sat upon that breakfast table, filled now not with mourning, but with the simple, steady joy of a husband and wife, beginning each new day exactly where they belonged, together.